Ravens flock was going on. So Ravens fans have been debating whether to play or rest the players on the team for the final game of the season against the Steelers. And it seems as though John Harbaugh has officially made his decision because he just announced that Lamar Jackson will not be playing in this final game. And I know a lot of people have been on the side of wanting them to play and, keep themselves warmed up and all that. But I've actually been on the side of resting the starters, especially Lamar. So I do agree with John Harbaugh's decision. I know it's a hard decision to make because you got to wonder, could it cause them to get cold? But at the same time, it's like, even if they play in this game, they're still going to get a bye week. So there's still a chance that they could get cold either way. But then also, you also got to remember, in 2020, we didn't rest any of our starters the last game of the season. Because remember, that year, we didn't have the playoffs clinched completely. And we actually did have to play all our guys all the way to the last game of the season. And it still didn't make us any better once we got into the playoffs. We did win that playoffs game in the revenge game against the Titans, but we didn't go much farther than that because we lost to the Bills in the next round. And that year we actually did get hot late in the year, but it still really didn't matter. So these decisions aren't black and white. So I really don't think that we could just say that without a shadow of a doubt that if these guys sit, that they're just going to be terrible when they come back. I don't really think that's the case. So I do agree with Harbaugh's decision. I think it's better to just let them rest up, guarantee that they'll be there when it's time to play. And if we risk being rusty, I don't really think that's a big deal. I would rather risk being rusty than risk having the unspeakable happen in this game against the Steelers. And I do believe that's also really the biggest factor that made Harbaugh decide to take this approach is the fact that it's a division game at the end of the season. If this was a non-division game against a team that was less physical than the AFC North, I think he probably would have said maybe we could throw them out there for 1 or 2 series. But to me, it made zero sense in a game that we have nothing to gain. We have nothing to gain in this game against the Steelers. So it made zero sense to me to risk the unspeakable happening because the Steelers want to try to take a couple cheap shots, especially when we know they got dirty players like TJ Watt out there who, if he get a chance to take a cheap shot, he would take it. Especially if he knows that we're only going to play our starters for one half because they're already assuming that we weren't going to play them anyway. So if we go out there and had those starters play in the game, they would take it 10 times more seriously because they know, hey, they might get taken out at any moment. So they're going to try to leave their mark on them while they still have a chance, while they're still on the field. So I don't think taking that risk would have been a good idea because remember, the Steelers still have something to play for right now. They're still fighting to secure a playoff spot and to secure as good a playoff positioning as possible when it comes to the seeding of the playoffs. So it just wouldn't make sense to me to try to risk injury just to avoid possibly being rusty, because we also got to remember, people would argue that we were rusty in that game against the Rams and we still scored 37 points. Even if you don't want to count the punt return touchdown that Tylan Wallace got, we still scored 31 points just on offense. So even if there was a chance that we would end up rusty, I don't think it would be the end of the world. I still think we're a good enough team, a talented enough team to make it work and overcome that. And mostly rust is just a mental thing anyway. And I think a lot of these players on this team, whether they were here in 2019 or not, they still have that chip on their shoulder of wanting to go all out and get the job done. When you see Lamar Jackson on the sidelines, he looks completely locked in. He's not playing around. And I think that this year is just a different year from 2019. And of course, that's why a lot of fans, they still wanted us to play, because half the fan base didn't even want to get the 1 seed. They wanted to just play the whole season out, even in the wild card. So I'm not surprised that they want the players to play the last game of the season. But to me, I just don't think that's the way to go. Because if Harbaugh were to let some of our most important players go out there and the unspeakable happens in the last game of the season after coming so far, everybody would want to take Harbaugh's head off, and everybody would be calling him an idiot for risking our entire playoff run just to put them in a useless game against the Steelers. It wouldn't make any sense. Many people argued that the way that they should approach this is to put them in there for a half and then pull them. But that doesn't make it any safer at the end of the day. So I still agree with Harbaugh's decision, because remember when we played the Bengals, Mark Andrews got injured on the first series of the game. And even in that same quarter, in the first quarter, Trey Hendrickson almost rolled Lamar's ankle. Now, thankfully, Trey, he kind of tilted his body in a way to where Lamar's ankles didn't completely get caught underneath him, but that could have been very bad. Like, did people just completely forget about that when that happened? That was probably the only moment this year where I was like legitimately shook this whole year. That was the one moment where I was like legitimately shook. Because we all saw that Lamar was slow to get up. And then when he got up, he went to the blue tent. And then the camera started panning to Tyler Huntley as he was like warming up, as if he was about to go in the game. And then even Lamar was wearing like a wrap around his ankle the rest of the game. So putting them in for one series or two series or a half, it's still not worth it. Because it only takes one play for things to just completely get sabotaged. That's all it takes. And it's not even just about Lamar. It's like there's a bunch of key players who I need to see them get rest. Patrick Queen, speaking of that Bengals game, Patrick Queen, in my opinion, I think he's been banged up since that Bengals game. Because I specifically remember there was one play when Joe Burrow was still in the game where PQ was chasing him out of bounds and he pushed him, and then he landed awkwardly on his shoulder. And now, a few weeks later, that same shoulder, it seems like it's starting to, like the injury is starting to be re-aggravated because he had a couple stingers in the last game. You know, Kyle Hamilton, we still got to make sure his knee's ready to go for the playoffs. There's no point of playing him. Same thing with Brandon Stevens or Marlon Humphrey. Marcus Williams, like he's essentially played this whole season with only like one good arm and one good hamstring. Like we already know the injury history this team has had the past 2 to 3 years. So risking it in that game, all in the name of wanting to avoid rust, I don't think that's the way to go. I can understand people wanting to do that. I understand why people want to do that. And it's a hard decision for Harbaugh to make, but ultimately I think he made the right decision, really. So let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think Harbaugh is making a mistake? Do you think that rust is real and they could risk being rusty? And do you believe that this team is still going to be able to do well even if we sit all our best players in the last week of the game? Oh, yeah, and one last thing. Like, even when you see other players talk about the bye week, most players want the bye week. I know Lamar said he wanted to play, but there's many players across the league who they want that number one seed just to get that rest. Like, even when you hear Jason Kelsey and Travis Kelsey on their podcast talk about the number one seed, they talk about how much they want to get that rest. They're not worried about rust. Like, the Chiefs have had the one seed before. The Eagles have had the one seed before. And it didn't stop them from playing well enough to make a deep run in the playoffs. So as long as we stay focused and keep working as hard as we would when we play the game, I still think we should be fine. But time will tell, and we got to just wait and see how things unfold.